Thank you, and start off by thanking Joe for making the invitation to myself and Pader, and to say hello to Pader, who I believe is watching this on the live web from Valencia in Spain, and I would gladly swap with him right now, I can promise you. Because not only have I the daunting task of introducing this book to the public for the first time, but I also have the daunting task of an extremely distinguished panel to respond to it. So I'm getting slightly more than I bargained for than when we first had a conversation with Joe about the book and the MacGill Summer School. But it's a fantastic opportunity, and thank you for being here to listen to it. So Padre and myself have been working on this book for the guts of a year that a lot changed, a year that really saw a transformation of politics in Ireland, and the book's title, Towards a Second Republic, Irish Politics After the Celtic Tiger, really sums up the degree to which the book is an argument for a Second Republic. And what we want to argue is that Don mentioned last night that there was a sense of optimism around, a sense that yes, maybe the tide is turning slightly and we will be able to get out of this. And certainly Padre and myself, I think, are natural born optimists and will always try and see the glass half full. But there's a fear that, in our enthusiasm to see it all right, that what we will try and do is to recreate the past or get back to where we were before it all went wrong. And what we really want to do in arguing in this book is that the Celtic Tiger was in trouble long before 2007 when it all went wrong. And we don't want to go back there. We really do want to see this moment as an opportunity, as an optimistic opportunity at this stage, to actually embark on developing a new model for the Irish Republic, one that won't be vulnerable to the unsustainable boom-bust cycle that we've been in. Now, we've had attempts before. We've set up in the 1920s, the 1950s we changed our economic development model, the 1980s we had to look at it again, we set up social partnership, and we're now looking at it again. What we want to do in opening up a project of a Second Republic is look at the possibilities of moving to a model that for once and for all achieves sustainability in terms of a more even path of development that won't be vulnerable to another boom and bust in the next decade, the next 2 decades, the next 3 decades. So basically in the book we have a number of key messages. First of all, we argue that the Irish political economy model is broken, and we have a look at what's wrong. We argue that a new paradigm is needed and that there are options available, that globalisation sets the context for that new development model, but it doesn't rule out choices, and different countries have made very different choices in the context of globalisation. But we argue really clearly that what's missing at the moment in the debate is what are the values through which we'll make a judgment call on any new model of development. So we ask, if we were to adopt a Second Republic, what values would underpin that Second Republic and would help us have a moral compass towards our decision making for the future? We argue that that Second Republic and the determination of the values of the Second Republic can only come about through an active deliberation, through citizens in the public sphere. And we look at the politics then of making that happen. So I'll try and get through this fairly quickly, but they're the 5 key parts of the presentation and hopefully the bits of the debate that the panel might be able to take up. The book isn't a book by political scientists. It's a book very much framed around a political economy understanding of the world. So we've heard it's the economy stupid a lot of the time, but we're arguing, really important, it's not just the economy stupid. We're arguing politics matters, and that there are choices that we can make as a people that can overcome some of the economic obstacles that we're facing. We're arguing that social outcomes are very much shaped by how the state and the market interrelate, and that social actors influence that hugely. So a political economy model looks at the state, market and society and how those 3 spheres interact with each other. It's not just all about the economy. We're highly conscious that we're making decisions as a national political economy in a context of globalisation. So the international political economy matters hugely. And we're highly conscious that we live in an environment, and the decisions that we make impact on that environment, and we have to take that environment into account in our political economy. So we're trying to deal with a framework that has 5 aspects. It has the state, the society, the economy, globalisation and the environment, and all those things matter and interact when we're trying to tease out what are the possible opportunities for the future. Because we're at a time of change now, we're at a critical juncture, and while change happens at times of crisis, we determine the nature of that change, of the type of crisis. So how we come out of this crisis will be an outcome of our own political choices and our own social actions. And that's very much the focus of the book, is a call to have that debate about what way we want to reshape Ireland coming out of this crisis. Nothing at this stage is inevitable. We have alternatives. So, a couple of chapters in the book dedicates themselves to the politics of Ireland and what's wrong with the state of Ireland. And I'm not going to go into it a lot, primarily because we looked at it quite a bit yesterday. But in politics, we do argue that to some degree the political culture of Ireland has been very much shaped by the degree to which one party dominated the state. And the party was a Fianna Fáil party that had a particular populist, localist, personalist, clientelist approach to politics. And that has very much influenced the political culture and how we do politics in Ireland today. A particular thing I do mention that maybe hasn't been drawn out that much in the debate so far is the degree to which there's an absence of ideological contestation in Ireland. We don't have your traditional right-left divide. We've had our tribal politics. And we have an abhorrence to some degree about talking about values, talking about the different choices that are available to us. We prefer to be pragmatic. We prefer to be problem-solving. We're quite short-term. And we would argue that over the last couple of decades, there's actually been an intensification of that tendency to shy away from hard talk about the politics of choices that we can make. To some degree, the monies available to us through the period of growth made hard choices easier, and there was money to spread around, and we didn't have to have hard political debate about our choices. And to some degree, there's been a smothering of dissent, I think, to some degree, as the state enveloped more and more of civil society in a relationship of partnership, which didn't allow a conflictual conversation with the state about those choices. So we've had a lot of coordinative discourse in quite private spaces within social partnership, within task forces, within committees. We've had less communicative debate in public spaces with the public about what kind of choices are facing us. Likewise with the bureaucracy, the permanent government, we've had some discussion about that yesterday as well, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But just to say that while some aspects of the Irish state are actually relatively strong, we have quite uneven capacity in the Irish state. The bureaucracy is affected by the same political culture, and to some degree it's interfaced with the power elite and it's captured by vested interests, and Nyberg and Rattling and all that have gone into that in a long. But just one thing that's been quite topical the last few days, the dismantling of FÁS and the set up the new agency Solus. FÁS is a very good example, I think, of the uneven capacity of the Irish state. It's a very good example of an agency that was developed by the Irish state in a certain political culture. And Nigel Boyle says it very well. When FÁS was allowed to develop as a kind of Swiss Army model for the Irish state, it could do a lot of things as an agency, and it was a handy, pragmatic agency through which to spend European funding. But like a Swiss Army knife that can do a lot of things, it doesn't do any one thing very well. So we have a sort of ambiguous capacity there in terms of its capacity to deliver what's needed for development. And the last thing, and I think that hasn't come out enough in our discussion about what's wrong with the Irish state, is the fact that it's a very, very gendered state. It's still a patriarchal state in both its politics and its bureaucracy and its economy. That really has a lot of contribution to the type of political culture that we have. And I think the degree to which gender inequality has been an undercurrent informing the development of the crisis, but also perhaps informing the way we're responding to the crisis, maybe is underappreciated and could get more focus in debate. So that's what's wrong with the state. What's wrong with the Celtic Tiger economic model? Look, there's a lot wrong, and we've had debates on the economy for the last few days, so I'm not going to dwell on it too lot. But we make three major fault lines are drawn out in the book. One, an over-reliance on a model that's highly contingent on foreign direct investment and doesn't pay enough attention to the development of indigenous industry. I think that's pretty clear to everybody now. But worryingly, in our responses to the crisis, we are continuing to depend very heavily on foreign direct investment as our major plank of economic development, and still, I think, not paying enough attention to developing indigenous industry. I've spoken already about the uneven capacity of the Irish state as one of the fault lines of the Irish state. And we also have a low tax model and an uneven tax base, and we know we're paying the price for that now in an unsustainable fiscal policy that collapsed very suddenly. With or without the crisis, we were arguing from the early 2000s that the Irish Celtic model was unsustainable. And we believed it was unsustainable in two primary factors. One, it was environmentally unsustainable because it was triggering a very, very high growth rate based on consumption, which at the end of the day is environmentally unsustainable, and that debate needed to be had about the Celtic Tiger model, both at a global level but also at a wider level around the nature of a consumption-led model that really is environmentally unsustainable. But the second thing that we said about it was that inequality was rising as that growth was happening, and that inequality itself is a primary driver of a speculative economy that leads to these kind of boom-bust cycles. And inequality was a very implicit value embedded into the Celtic Tiger model. Some of you may remember Michael MacDougall's comments in 2004, where he argued that inequality wasn't only an inevitable outcome of the model of economic development we have, it was also a desirable outcome because it was proof your economy was going well if some people's income was rising so fast that it caused wider inequality to grow. So we were arguing all along before the crisis that this model wasn't the most desirable model, it wasn't the best model for Ireland, and in the longer term it was going to lead to environmental unsustainability and social unsustainability. And we would still argue that is the case. So the worrying things when we hear at conferences like this that, okay, get back to 2002, the supply side factors are still strong, it's really a matter of tweaking this or that, we're uncomfortable with that. We're optimistic that things are turning, but this is still the opportunity to make sure we don't go back to 2002. I suppose we're sort of applying it to saying that, look, if you had a car that kept breaking down, at some stage you have to accept that that car isn't going to work anymore and that you need a new model. Now, we can keep trying to keep the old car on the road again, fix it up, put on a few new spare tyres and get it back out there, or we can say, look, for once and for all, we're going to invest in a new one. We're at that stage. We have to make that choice. For those who are... This is Santa at a Christmas tree and he's asking a little child, have you been competitive this year? And I have to acknowledge Terence MacDonagh as the source of that cartoon, and I took it without his permission. But we've been arguing a long time that one of the key social ills with the model of capitalism that we have is that we have made society residual to competitiveness. We have made competitiveness the overriding logic of all that we do, and we have forgotten about human development as a goal of our national project. State policy has created clear winners and losers. Some of the state policy has produced very good outcomes. I was the Assistant General Secretary of the National Organisation of the Unemployed when we had 300,000 unemployed. That job growth that came about, the lowering of unemployment to 4%, the virtual ending of long-term unemployment, we can't really appreciate the real difference that made to so many hundreds of thousands of families in this country who got hope again after the dark 80s and early 1990s. That job growth was really important, and we shouldn't forget the successes of the Celtic Tiger in that regard. But I would argue that we never used the advantages that we had in the economy when it was going well to really tackle the inequality. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this because we talked about it last night in relation to the extent of inequality in the education system. We'll hear about it later in relation to health. But one indicator would also be, and we'll hear about it later in social protection, even when we had 4% unemployment, we still had about 20% of the working age population dependent on social welfare. So we never went the extra mile to really make sure that we were using the benefits of the economic growth to develop the capacity of society to really be fully productive and participate in society and the economy. We never took on that hard challenge. And what I call arrested social development came out of that. Our social outcomes were inconsistent with our level of economic well-being or our level of wealth in the economy. And we also had significant growth in a new class of rich that led to growing economic inequality and obviously linked to power inequality. So basically just a short argument about what's wrong with politics in Ireland, what's wrong with the economic model in Ireland, and what's wrong with the social outcomes that came from it, and trying to build up the argument in the book that we really do need to change the model, that it's not a matter of recapturing the model as it was in 2002, that won't be good enough, it won't get us where we need to go. So don't rebuild what we had. Use the opportunity, a bit like that idea with the Beveridge report, use the opportunity of coming out of World War II to really reframe what's required as a society moving forward. But that requires us to think long and hard about our values. Because you can't reframe you can't even pick a political reform model, an economic model, a social model, without knowing what you're trying to achieve. And you can't know what you're trying to achieve without having a firm sense of what values are driving your decision making. And it's been quite astounding, I think, every single day from the Taoiseach's address on Sunday night, at least a couple of speakers a day have picked up the theme of values as requiring serious public debate in Ireland. So all choices are informed by our underlying value base. And the concept of a second republic, I believe, allows us the opportunity to revisit values as a key issue in Irish society. And I suppose we might ask, well, what values can we take from the First Republic and bring with us into the Second Republic? And herein, I think we have a very strong argument for the Second Republic, because I think to some degree, the First Republic never really enunciated a clear set of values through which to guide our economic and social development. I remember being with my daughter in France, in Antibes in France last year, 15-year-old, and she saw on the state secondary schools in France, they have liberty, equality, fraternity, the values of the French state, framing the door of the secondary schools. And she was reading it, and she said to me, "What have we got?" And I was struck to answer, because it couldn't immediately come to mind a value set that was the equivalent of what informed the development of French society. So to some degree, I think the absence of values in framing the First Republic, we did have values that were around uniting the Republic, we had values around the Irish language, but we didn't have values that could more easily inform economic and social development. In the absence of those values, I think very quickly church values dominated the early part of the First Republic, and as they waned, I think market values easily found a space in the vacuum of state values. So there aren't maybe so many foundational values that we want to take with us, because some of the foundational values that we had, we might choose at this stage to leave behind. And I'm thinking of the value of inequality that Michael MacGill promoted, maybe the deference to authority that we saw so clearly in the Cloynes, Murphy and Ryan report, and maybe the value of patriarchy, which still is very much underpinning some of the gender inequality that we have. There are also some foundational values that we've had in the First Republic that we may want to keep, but I believe maybe require reworking. So the value of community, I think we hear again and again, is still a very strong value in Ireland. But we might want to ask, what does living in a community mean in a 21st century, more urbanised, more diverse environment? So the values that, that debate has to be a very public debate. We've never really had the opportunity for that debate in the First Republic. And before you could really name a Second Republic, it would have to go through a public process of thinking about those values. And to some degree, there's a lot of tools that can help us think about those values and think about the role of citizens as activists in framing their own value system as a society. So, like from political theory, we have the work by Dahl and Leipart, who talk about what kind of values might underpin political institutions. From Republican theory, we have Petit and Honohan, and they're thinking about how values come out of Republican theory. And from equality theory, Baker and Lynch in UCD give us a lot of material and tools to think about it. So we're not starting with a blank sheet when we try and think about values. There are tools to help us. And Irish debate is ongoing about this. There's already lots of contributors, even in the last few days. But taking from that literature, I think what Padra and myself have been trying to develop out is some values that would inform our vision of a Second Republic. And we call it a Second Republic because everybody's vision of it might be different. And we're only laying out our own stall. What we're trying to do in that is to start out a debate by showing you our values. But it's the debate about the values that's important. We're not trying to particularly set ours. It's a starting point. Some of the values that we draw on lead us to the idea that an open participatory public sphere is absolutely essential for a healthy society, politics and economy. And it's one thing, as I said, we've been lacking to some degree in Ireland. So a Second Republic would really need a healthy public sphere of open contestation of ideas, something that maybe we've lacked to date apart from spaces like this. We're equally clear that active citizenship requires some level of equality of those citizens. You can't have an active citizenship unless everybody has the resources in terms of literacy and numeracy, in terms of the competence and self-esteem, to be able to participate in that debate, in the politics of how they're governed. So to have a contestatory democracy, the education system has to be really, really spot on in terms of growing a civic-minded citizenship and one with the skills to actually participate in a democracy. So no model of development or democracy would be sustainable, we'd argue, unless it really attends to those issues of equality and human development through developing human capacity through education. It's also, we believe, a value about recognising and taking responsibility for our interdependence with each other. And whether that's about littering the streets or it's about the notion of us all being responsible for the children that exist in our society, it's about really, really recognising the interdependence of citizens and taking responsibility for that. It's not all about the state, it's not all about the market. It's also about recognising our intergenerational interdependencies as well. And from a gender equality perspective, I think drawing out a care ethic, a value of care underpinning our economic and social policies. Care of ourselves across the generations, our younger and our older generations, but also care of our environment. So we believe that these kind of values can help to prompt us to think more clearly about what kind of social and economic policies would deliver these kind of principles. So moving on then in the book, we try and apply those values to a reform agenda. And we ask ourselves, well, if you had value-led political reform in a second republic, what would it look like? And I suppose we'd make the argument that some of the debate about political reform in Ireland to date has been very driven by issues of accountability, effectiveness, efficiency, more effective government. We think it also needs more emphasis on issues of equality and participation. The debate has been very good to date, and I think, despite Micheál Martin's comments yesterday, that some of the reform agenda that is elucidated in the programme for government does have the potential to make a real difference around issues of accountability and effectiveness, but perhaps it hasn't focused enough on the issues of the equality of citizenship and participation of citizens. So there is, we would argue, if you had a process of rebuilding a second republic, that there would be an opportunity for constitutional revision, and that would be an opportunity to state those values clearly in a constitutional framework, the value of care, the value of children. Then moving on to the more institutional debate about political reform, and I'm happy to reflect that the book takes up some key issues in political reform that we believe are still outstanding. And many of those were taken up in the debate yesterday, and there seems to be a body of consensus emerging around what they need to be, around local government reform, the issue of a taxation source for local government. We believe the retention of the Seanad probably would be more useful than its abolition, because it gives us the opportunity maybe to develop a participatory forum for citizens, with maybe building in the regional, local development model in a federal model possibly. We believe gender quotas would be necessary, but meaningful ones that actually do achieve an outcome at the other end. We believe that there are lots of ways to improve the electoral system. There was a discussion on compulsory voting yesterday, but there's lots of other things that can address the issue of voter participation, particularly of young people. Prior to that is citizenship education and the whole idea of developing that public sphere, that idea of the media and civil society actively contesting ideas and making politics relevant and exciting for people to be involved in. We also look at Northern Ireland, because if you're thinking about a second republic, an obvious question is, well, how does the Republican agenda, as it was traditionally known in Ireland, come into this space? And we would argue that, whilst it may not be a point in time now, that there is a way of developing these political reforms agenda so that they at least enable in the future, if and when a time arose, emerging into it. So, for example, if we were to retain the Seanad as a civic forum, there's the possibility of building that into a North-South civic forum along the lines originally intended in the Good Friday Agreement. So there's a way of building your new political institutions so they can anticipate down the road, if and when it happens, that merging in whatever shape it might happen. So the political reform agenda, we believe that really the book, it doesn't deflect from, but the whole issue of separation of powers, Donald de Butler there in 1986 and I think in 1998 launched an agenda for a second republic at the time of the last crisis in 86. And key in the debate that he had was the idea of the separation of powers, and we discussed that a little bit the other day. Now, in that debate, there's the idea of you either have a fused system where your cabinet comes from your TDs, as we have at the moment, or you have a completely separate system. There are some countries where they have a variety of choices in it, where you can take your cabinet from your TDs or you can select from outside. Now, I think Donal is going to take up that debate later, but we do believe it's a debate that needs to be had, it needs to be exhausted fully, and Ireland would benefit from that debate. We're not sure what the conclusion of it would be. And likewise with electoral reform. There are options there for electoral reform. We touched on it a little bit yesterday, and we'll touch on it again. Our own sense in the book, and what we conclude, having exhausted the debate a little bit in the book on these two very big institutional issues, is that to some degree they may be not so much red herrings because they are important debates, but we would rather see all the other stuff happen for definite than maybe put all our energy into a very exhaustive debate on the very big reform options, which may well be an inconclusive debate in the end. So we say, we'd rather see all this happen for sure than to exhaust the possibilities on the bigger institutional questions, but we do address them in the book. On the political economy options for a second republic, and going back to that relationship between state, society and market, we're very clear that the national option for reformulating our economic development model does happen in the context of globalisation. And globalisation does set some obstacles, some barriers, some context certainly around it. But what we want to argue is that our overarching goal for our economic and social development model should not be competitiveness. It should be the development of our humans, our society. We have to make the economy work for society. What we have been doing is making society work for the economy. Now, within an overarching development goal of human development, there are any number of varieties of capitalism or economic models that you can adopt. The one we have at the moment, and that we're leaning towards even in the discussions here, but I think that the programme for government articulates most clearly, is a neoliberal minimalist state model. So it affords a lot of primacy to the role of the market in driving the economy, and it talks about less statism, minimalist state in relation to the role of the state in driving the development of the country. There are other options. One that we want to put on the table is a developmental welfare state model, where the role of the market is lessened to some degree and the role of the state is made more primary as the driver of development in the country. And there's also an ecological, environmental, steady state economy, where again the state has a very clear role in making sure that the economic development that we have is consistent with an environmental sustainability. Now, in any of these models, there are trade-offs to be had. For example, in the developmental social democratic model, it does tend to emphasise growth as a key driver of that model, and that does have implications for the environment. The ecological model assumes maybe less to no growth sometimes, but that may have implications for things like job creation and society. So we're not particularly saying it's one or the other of these models. What we're saying is that to be clear that we have choices about the model of development we have tools through which to discuss those choices, and that the choice that we adopt will fit our own national context and will have to be in the context of globalisation, but that we do have those choices. And I think to some degree what we're seeing even in the programme for government that we have is some trade-offs between a neoliberal minimalist state model, low taxation, small state, less government, but also a developmental social democratic model of the type that Rory Quinn was putting on the agenda last night, and that trade-off of really strong state capacity in steering the future of tertiary education. So a very clearly defined role for the state, recognising its responsibility to build the capacity of human development and not to leave it solely to the market. So already we're engaging in those two models to some degree. We would argue that the ecological steady state model isn't particularly heavily on the agenda of any country, but if we're taking peak oil and climate change seriously, as we would argue you need to, there's a wake-up call coming very soon that I think will elevate these models. And the other thing is, I said there are tools available conceptually to think about this, but we've also had these on the agenda of the Irish development debate for a long time. The National Economic and Social Council, for example, brought out a really useful report in 2005 called the Developmental Welfare State. CORE have done a lot of work on ecological and environmental models. So these debates are ongoing, but they're not public. They're in closed doors, they're in partnership, they're not discussed as part of our everyday politics, and that's what we're trying to do, is develop that out. And I hear a little bell there. So, in terms of developing that out, we would argue that the contestation of ideas is absolutely important. And that requires this emerging contested space. And I suppose we're happy to say, to some degree, that there is evidence in Ireland of citizens beginning to realise, if we want this place to be better, we have to get involved in it. So you have organisations emerging, like We the Citizen, like a Second Republic. Some of them say that they're value-free spaces, and what they want to do is bring citizens together so that they can participate and maybe evolve sets of values. Others bring people together to participate. MacGill does, the Chambers Ireland, Irish Times had a big series on the Republic. Your Country, Your Call was another initiative. So there are lots of initiatives of trying to stimulate thinking, debate, development from citizens. We would argue that quite a few of them are framed in an understanding of a neoliberal model of development and assume that that's the way forward. Others are trying to put other developmental models on the agenda. So you have organisations like TASC, ICTU, Social Justice Ireland, various NGOs putting those kind of agendas on. And then in the more environmental sphere, you have organisations like Cultivate, FASTA, the Transition Towns Movement, Clough-Jordan, Show Me Spree. So there are bubbles around the place that are heavily promoting those debates. For us, one of the problems is that they're not particularly talking to each other. So a lot of the work that's been done to try and promote different models of development is happening in very clustered spaces or in siloed spaces, and we're not getting that debate to the level of a public debate that could really bring about a tipping point in moving to a new paradigm of development. And that's one of our challenges now, is really developing that public sphere into a much more public space where more and more people are involved in that debate in a meaningful way. I'm going to skip that for reasons of time. I'm not going to skip this because I think it is important, because in our call for a public sphere, which is what I've just done, and our call for active citizens to be the driver of a means to a second republic, is very much influenced by our own understanding of how change happens. And we're indebted here to people like Colin Hay and Robert Cox, political economists who have studied this at a global level. And what they argue is actually quite simple, and I think can help understand better the process through which a second republic can come about. And at the risk of simplicity, it's simply that change happens when people have ideas or values that they want to promote, when they gather together as people, as interests to promote those values, and when they have institutions or spaces or places where they can bring those values as people to debate and to convince other people about. And to some degree, I've argued that Ireland is a country that in its first republic didn't engage enough around values and ideas, and we need to do that. It's a country where we had a lot of vested interests who were predominantly looking in a siloed way at their own sectoral interests. So our interests need to recognise our interdependency and begin to engage with each other more about their values. And it's a place where our institutions have tended to be quite closed to public debate and maybe focusing too much on a coordinated partnership approach that doesn't engage the voter or even to some degree the political parties. So I would be arguing that the institutions need to move away from a partnership model and into a more political open model of debate and contestation. So you need those three things working together for effective change to happen. So the politics of this, and this is my last slide to reassure, the politics of achieving a second republic, how would that happen? Now, on Monday at 11 o'clock, we opened up after the Taoiseach's address with this question: has Irish politics transformed? What can we say about contemporary Irish politics that it might achieve a sustainable political economy for Ireland? And I must admit, to some degree, I'm not that encouraged about what I heard there, because what I heard clearly was Frank Flannery identifying Fine Gael as moving to the right and arguing for less state, less role for the state, which can only imply to some degree more role for the economy, because he wasn't particularly talking about the role of citizens or society either. We heard about Fianna Fáil identifying themselves as a centre-left party, but very proudly still declaring that they're not blinded by ideology. Now that would seem to me to see a persistence of a pragmatic, value-free kind of political culture of old. So I'm not convinced that there's an agenda in either of those two parties that could see its way to thinking big about a sustainable, very significant paradigmatic shift. That leaves you the possibility of maybe the emergence of a left-right cleavage in Irish politics. Noel Whelan put that on the table. But the absence of a green agenda, and that will be quite worrying. So the future of green politics in Ireland needs to come in. And there is the possibility still, of course, of a new party. So to some degree, politics, all has changed and nothing has changed at the same time. And the jury has to be out, I suppose, at the moment on whether we will be able to arrive at a government or a politically led project on equality and sustainability as a new model. So I don't think we should underestimate the amount of change that's happened, but I don't think we should overestimate it either. But it does mean that there's much to play for. And if our analysis of the capacity of the political system to deliver that change is right, it means that the play has to come from below. The play has to come from the active citizens, the power from below to push the political parties in the direction of a more sustainable Ireland. That has to come through that active public sphere that I spoke about. So to some degree, I suppose, the creation of the First Republic was very much a project from below. It was a project of the citizens of what was then not Ireland, the Irish state, but pushing a power elite to create something. And I think we're again at that stage where we need to control our own destiny, and it's active citizenship that will bring us there. So the politics of achieving the Second Republic will not necessarily be a political party project. It will have to come from below and be animated from below. And that's very much what the book is trying to do, is contribute to that capacity for debate and to animate that debate from Irish society so that the power will come from below. And I'll leave you with that notion. Thank you.